Welcome back. You're watching Global Eye. The International Labour Organization has released a report on world employment and social outlook for the year 2023. The report dives into understanding the value of essential workers and analyzes the working conditions of these workers. Those that fall under 8 main occupational groups such as health, food systems, security, among others, qualify as key workers. The findings from the report highlight a significant discrepancy between the value of work and the working conditions of key workers. The main findings from the report show that key workers are at an increased risk of occupational safety and health. They are heavily reliant on temporary jobs and are subject to long, irregular work hours as well as low pay. The report calls for investing in essential services, including investments in improving the working conditions of those who perform critical work. Let me now go across to Janine Berg, Senior Economist at the International Labour Organization. Thank you very much for joining us. Give us a sense of the kind of challenges, the risks and the pay inequalities when it comes to key and essential workers across the world, and which are the economies where these inequalities, where these risks are the most glaring.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. So we see amongst the key workers, we see problems in working conditions among all the groups. And this is actually something that's not just specific to poorer countries. We see the same problems also in richer countries. There are differences amongst the poorer countries and the richer countries in terms of which are the occupations that are most prominent in key work. So for example, in higher income countries, 1 out of every 5 key workers is in healthcare, whereas in lower income countries, it's just 1 out of every 50 workers are in healthcare. And most of the key workers in poorer countries are in agriculture. So we have problems that are specific to those occupations. So in agriculture, for example, there tends to be very low pay. There's often some national regulations exclude agricultural workers from some of the labor protections. Many are also self-employed. They don't have access to social protection. There's occupational safety and health risks in the work that they do, either exposure to pesticides, for example, exposure to sun, all of those issues. In the other occupations, we have another range of lists. But what we saw in the pandemic is that there, well, of course, and we know this, because these people had to leave the safety of their homes to go to work, to provide these goods and services that all of us rely upon, they were more exposed to getting ill. And so we found in the analysis that we did of mortality, for example, that key workers had a higher mortality rates than non-key workers. And then amongst them that we see, for example, transport workers were the group that had the highest rates of mortality.
Right. Now, speaking about India, any particular risk groups among the 8 categories that you identified in India? Your report speaks about the health hazards for rickshaw pullers, app-based taxi drivers.
Yes, so there's certainly, I mentioned agricultural workers, and that of course is a very prominent occupation in India, but then you have food vendors. Many of them are self-employed, they work long hours, they don't have social protection. Transport workers in general, so those could be the rickshaw pullers, there could be taxi drivers. Those occupations in general don't have very good protections, and they were also more exposed to risk during the pandemic. There's also security workers who faced violence and harassment. We saw during the pandemic elevated levels of verbal abuse, threats, physical assaults that could have been directed at different categories of workers, but were very prominent amongst health workers, amongst food vendors, and amongst security workers. In the category of health workers, the report looks at the situation of the ASHAs in India, the community health workers. First of all, for the important role that they played during the pandemic in providing services, providing vaccines, informing people about how to take care of themselves during the pandemic. But then we also see that there's also some deficiencies in their working conditions because these workers are not considered employees, and they don't have, as a result, they don't have all of the labor and social protections that would come with being classified as an employee.
Right. How do salaries and health facilities for key and essential workers in India compare to those in other parts of the world?
Yeah, so health facilities, I mean, all over the world, there's problems with underinvestment in health. And this is a widespread issue. The WHO has announced that there's a global shortage of nurses across the world. And this, of course, has repercussions on people's working conditions in the hospitals. So if you're a nurse and there's an understaffing of nurses, then that means that you're going to have more work, higher work intensity. You're going to have to probably work more overtime. And so all of this results in excessive work, long hours, which then can lead to burnout. And we saw during the pandemic that there were high levels of burnout. And of course, that means that contributes to the ongoing problem that we're seeing across the world of labor shortages in health. In the health sector as well, we see a lot of subcontracting and agency work, which in principle could be fine. But what happens often is that people they might be working shoulder to shoulder, but they have different contractual arrangements and not the same rights and benefits as people that would have more permanent contracts. So this is something that we recommend that one can have flexibility in contractual arrangements, but we want to make sure that these contractual arrangements give the same rights and benefits to workers, so that the flexibility of those contractual arrangements is used because of the flexibility, but not as a means to lower pay, to lower working conditions.
All right. Janine, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us with the ILO's outlook for the working conditions of key and essential workers, and what are some of the interventions that we need in order to improve their conditions and thereby increase their productivity as well. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Don't go anywhere. News continues on CNBC TV 18.